Good afternoon, class. I'm going to continue. It's late afternoon here on Tuesday, and I'm going to continue with comments made in class earlier today to try to keep us on pace despite our shortened week here. So our topic here is we're looking at the change that starts to happen by the mid-19th century. By the mid-1800s, we're seeing a switch, a gradual switch to what we can start to refer to as a market economy in the United States. And of course, this switch to a market economy is going to have tremendous consequences for our natural environment in the United States. And I guess more specifically, consequences for the relationship between humans and their natural environment. So we're looking at a roughly 100-year period, and our real term for this week is the changing modes of production. At least the beginning of this week we'll be looking at the changing modes of production. Specifically, one way of thinking about our comments that I began today and will continue here is that as a capitalist system, a market-based capitalist system starts to settle into the United States, really beginning its intensity by the mid-1800s, we're going to see a really different transformation. And it does have consequences for the natural environment, but it also has consequences for how you, me, how various members of our society behave. We're going to increasingly be brought from a situation where we at once competed against ourselves for the all-important need to survive, where we competed to make sure that our land was properly planted and harvested, and we kept ahead, looking ahead to make sure that our needs for the winter would be met, so on and so forth. But now we're going to, with the onset of a market economy, we're going to increasingly be competing with each other. We're going to embrace that competitive, enterprising spirit that seems to come hat in hand with capitalism. So that's part of the story that's going to be told here. So here we are. We left off today talking about kind of the typical look of a subsistence farm. We're looking at these modes of production and how a subsistence mode of production, where a small farm and a family on a small farm work very hard to meet the needs that their family has so that they can subsist. And by the mid-1800s, what we're going to start to see happen is a switch to a market revolution and a transformation to a market-based economy. And this doesn't happen at the same time across the board. Of course, as is oftentimes the true of change, is it's usually uneven. It happens differently in different places. And so in general terms, what we can say is that the United States of the mid-1800s, and this says 18th century, we can think of this process as beginning in the mid-1700s and continuing to the 1800s. But the process features essentially coastal settlements that are among the first to adopt a market economy and a mode of production that involves a capital market-driven mode of production. And then on the interior, the farther you get essentially from the coast, the more likely you will be to remain in a subsistence mode of production. Like imagine a small family farm of say 80 to 100 acres where you're eking out your existence largely relying upon the land. So this makes sense in many respects. The coastal ports where the exports of the United States are being sent to markets abroad, as is typically the case with commercial hubs, is they tend to urbanize and urbanize rather quickly. So that explains cities like Seattle and Portland and San Diego and of course Boston and other cities farther south. So we're seeing this dual economy set in, and it has really interesting consequences. So we're going to see that essentially one of the characteristics that determines whether you will be part of a subsistence mode of production or a market mode of production is how far you live from the infrastructure within these newly growing United States. So if one finds himself 25 to 30 miles from a river that would tie you to the ports of the East, or a road that would tie you to the ports of the East, then you're more likely to be a subsistence, or to find your existence from a subsistence mode of production. And this is really critical. Now what I want to point out here, and I started to do this the other day in class, is that there are fundamental tensions that go along. I mean, there are consequences that come from one's decision to move from a subsistence mode of production to a market-based mode of production, where one is more firmly under the grip of capitalism. Because as Thomas Jefferson noted, when one controls his or her land, sure, it's a lot of work, and there are a lot of challenges that go with making one's living and subsisting off the land, but there's also a tremendous amount of freedom to have that goes along with that. So if we think about capitalism, which really features and encourages an inequality of wealth, right? Certain people invest, they make many of the profits. We have a larger class of laborers, they tend to work. Their profits aren't as great because they're being paid wages, which if a capitalist is, really engaging in a high profit margin, that means he's paying his laborers an appropriate minimum, or at least appropriate for him, so that he can keep as many of those profits for himself. So this kind of explains, the inequity or inequality of wealth within a society, particularly within a market-based capitalist society. But in a subsistence, a society that practices a subsistence mode of production, there is greater equality. And so the fundamental tension that even our founders, like Thomas Jefferson, become aware of is, here in the United States we've established a system of democracy which really treats the power and influence and vote of individuals equally. But yet our economic system is one that tends to stress inequality and not a very equitable distribution. So the question becomes, can democracy truly exist in a society that has such an unequal distribution of wealth? And folks like Thomas Jefferson were concerned about this because they feared that, the more you put a person, you free them up from their relationship to the land, the more likely they are to fall in, and perhaps ultimately their vote in a democratic system may very well fall to someone else's influence. If you think about that, I mean, some of the most ruggedly individual people within our current society are farmers, right? They have their land, they plant their crops, or they grow their head of cattle or sheep or what have you, and even though it's a lot of work, at the end of the day they feel more or less as though they are free and independent because their existence doesn't need to come down from someone else. It doesn't flow from a boss who writes their paycheck. They are effectively free and clear of all those sometimes messy constraints. So Jefferson believed, his agrarian ideal was that if the United States could be a nation of farmers, it would also be a nation of perfect democracy. That, essentially you remain free, you decide the issues based on what you think is true and what is the best, who is the best leader and what are the best policies. And if anyone else feels different, that's fine, but you will exercise your freedom to vote as you see fit. Now, if you enter into a market or capitalist-based society, now we start to have situations take place where an individual's boss might tell them, hey, you know what, if the policies are changed here, and if we have to worry about the cleanliness of our air, the cleanliness of our water, I might have to lay off some people. And in a capitalist or market-based mode of production society, you could start to have situations where the people are no longer truly free because they're afraid about where their next meal will come from, how they're going to feed their family, how they're going to put clothes on their back. And these issues increasingly seem to involve other people or involve events beyond their control. unlike that of the individual yeoman farmer of Jefferson's agrarian ideal. Now, we will point out that it may seem like a hypocrisy or a contradiction that here we have Jefferson, who believes in the freedom of individuals and the equality, so on and so forth. After all, this guy wrote in the Declaration of Independence that we're all equal with certain inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But even Jefferson was clearly divided on the institution of slavery, and one of his famous quotes is that slavery is like a wolf that you're holding by the ears. You don't want to hold on to it, meaning you don't want to keep it, but at the same time you're afraid of what will happen if you let go of it. And so Jefferson was far from consistent and far from clear on some of these matters. So I'm going to leave this slide. So Jeffersonian democracy, this kind of reinforces what I've already said a little bit about what the promise is of when you put individual people in charge of individual plots of land, that this is essentially the key to a winning political system. Jefferson and his counterparts would have compared the United States to Europe, which had begun to industrialize and become a manufacturing center of the world economy. And he didn't necessarily think that was a good thing. People were becoming wage laborers. They were becoming separated from their work. Their work was no longer a source of pride. Their work was now just, sewing buttons or placing widgets in place. That people were essentially becoming alienated from their work. There was very little satisfaction. And so, again, for Jefferson, the solution here was to have people with their individual bits of land. Okay. So another thing that starts to drive this process of change by the mid 1800s is the idea of market farming. So market farming is, of course, different from subsistence farming in the sense that generally market farmers produce a lot of just a few things, maybe just one or two things, and then they sell the surplus to buyers who then take that and sell it in stores or markets in the East. And of course, other differences here are that market farming usually requires greater inputs. Since you're harvesting a higher volume, you of course have to put things in the soil to replenish the nutrients that are lost when you grow crops. So things like manure, fertilizers. Here you see a picture. This is actually supposed to depict guano. These are all seagulls, and of course seagulls, doing what they do, they defecate on land, and as a result of their defecation, there are essentially all sorts of fertilizer. Guano is essentially just bird poop, and this is a very valuable form of fertilizer, and it became a very important input for the market farming that starts to happen in the 1800s. So these other things, these breakthroughs are critical to allowing market farming to happen. Now the problem is that when you do intensify your farming, people tend to specialize. They become a little less independent because they're growing just one or two or three things, and they're growing a lot of them. But that means that they are now dependent upon other people to meet some of their needs. And this starts to become a little bit dangerous or a little bit unstable. Folks like Thomas Jefferson maybe would not be quite so fond of this system, where individuals are sort of placing their well-being and security outside of their own control. And of course now you're working for the profit motive, so the emphasis has changed from use value, growing and producing things for use, to growing and producing things for exchange. And this of course means that as far as the natural environment is concerned, there's really no such thing as too much of anything, because you can always sell the extra to the market, and then you can convert that into a storable form of wealth. Okay? So the real transformation here are a couple things: a market revolution and a transportation revolution. So once things like roads and bridges and railroads and things like that start to extend more deeply into the American interior, which starts to happen in the mid-1800s, then we see an opening up and a transformation from a subsistence mode to a market mode of production across the U.S. economy. So with that, I will stop. Have a great night.